Played in San Remo 1930 featuring Alekhine as white versus Nimsowitch as black. The game begins with black initiating the French defense. And the idea of this, of course, is to support his pawn thrust to d5 into the center. White defends his e-pawn with his knight, but he could have avoided the pin on his knight that occurs when black places bishop to b4. This is known as the winnower variation of the French defense. White advances his e-pawn to e5, attacking the d6 and f6 squares and cramping black's position. This pawn c5 is one of black's most significant moves in the French defense. The idea is to attack white's pawn chain and center pawn in the center with a flank pawn. So I'm pinning his knight by playing the bishop to d2. Black plays the knight to e7 and prepares the castle, and white advances his knight aggressively. Here the knight attacks black's weak square on d6. A knight on d6 would be very strong, as it would be deep behind enemy lines, and d6 itself is a hole, being no black pawn can attack it. Therefore, a knight on d6 cannot be driven away by a pawn, making it very strong. Black exchanges bishops, and he castles. With f4, we can see that white has established a massive pawn center. Attacking white's knight a second time and threatening to capture it. White plays a4 to defend his knight a second time. Now would be a good time to pause the video and see if you can find what move white played. If you found pawn b4, then you were right. White takes the initiative on the queen side with this move and prevents black's knight from going to a5, where it would attack white's weak square on b3. Pawn exchange. And white plants his knight deep in black's position, taking advantage of the hole on d6. With pawn f5, though black stops the advance of white's pawns on the king side, his more urgent problems are on the queen side. Black should have played pawn to a5, planning to meet pawn b5 with knight b4, or he could have, or a reasonable alternative, he could have challenged white's knight on d6 by playing knight c8, dislodging it from its position. So white continues to advance his pawns on the queen side. He trades his knight for a bishop. This trade is important as, due to black's weaknesses on the light squares on the queen side, removing black's light squared bishop would be to white's advantage. Driving away the black queen. Now, white begins to build up and attack black's knight on c6. instead of retreating his knight, Black chooses to defend his knight on c6. As if the knight is retreated, this would enable white to penetrate with his rooks and queen along the open c-file. By castling, white brings a second rook into play, seeking to prevent knight g5, even though this was not an immediate threat. Now bring a rook onto the open c-file to attack Black's knight a second time. Black defends his knight a second time. By moving his rook to c2, White seeks to double his rooks along the c-file, adding even more pressure to the Black knight. By moving the queen to e8, we notice that Black creates a pin for himself along the a4 to e8 diagonal. However, he chooses to endure this to add even more protection to his knight. White doubles his rooks along the c-file, though a faster way to victory would have been to move his queen to c1 with the intent, and this would be followed by rook to a3, then to c3, tripling along the c-file. Black prepares to double rooks along the c-file to add defense to his knight. Opening up the c1 square for White's queen, and thus preparing to triple along the c-file. Black, in the meantime, prepares to move his king to the queen side to aid in the defense there. Now, White has completed tripling along the c-file, and Black is mobilizing all of his pieces to the defense of his knight. Now would be another good time to pause the video and see if you can find what White played. If you found bishop a4, then you are right. White clears the b5 square for use by his pawn, intending to drive to attack and to win Black's pin knight on c6. Black sacrifices his pawn to delay the loss of the knight, and in the meantime continues with his plan of bringing his king to the queen side. White threatens pawn b5 once more. This is after this move, pawn h4. What we have here is an amazing zugzwang position, even though most of the pieces are still on the board. Any move that Black makes, other than a pawn move, will result in the immediate loss of material. And furthermore, White will simply play waiting moves and run Black out of pawn moves. There's nothing that he can do here to stave off the immediate loss of material, and as such, Black resigned here.